So I read a book, and I actually have the physical copy this time. So we're just gonna... Perfect. The Giver holds a special place in my heart. It's one of the many books I received from my 5th grade teacher in a box during one of the most traumatic periods of my life. These books mean everything to me because they were mine and they couldn't be taken away like pretty much everything else in my life had been. I am, to this day, incredibly grateful for that teacher's generosity. Since these were the only books that I had consistent access to for about 5 months, and in a time before I had access to smartphone technology, that means I read most of these books multiple times. But it's been a while since I've read The Giver, and in 7th or 8th grade, my librarian asked me to read Sun and tell her how it went. It was a new arrival in the library, and that's the last book in this series. It's called The Giver Quartet. I was too depressed at the time and didn't have the energy to go and read the whole series, and I loved The Giver, and I did love Sun. But now I'm medicated, and I no longer want to dance on railroad tracks. On my journey to fall back in love with reading, I am now ready to try and tackle some book series. Last year, it was just reading a book a month to get into the habit of reading again. Book series are a huge step from standalones, and I completed a series already, and I'm ready to keep pushing myself to keep this energy going, to really retrain myself to love reading as I had as a kid. And if you're confused about the link between depression and a book series, for me, it's that book series and fantasy novels require a lot more commitment in terms of mental energy than their standalone and real-world setting counterparts. It's a huge time commitment, and that's what caused me to struggle with book series, coupled with my social anxiety that kept me out of unfamiliar libraries to the point where I just abandoned reading for pleasure entirely. It has been a journey, and I am circling back to my old stomping grounds, trying to pick up where I left off. The other series I read this year is actually another book I read in middle school that I knew was a trilogy, but never had the energy to read. So, with all the dramatics aside, let's get into The Giver. Spoilers ahead for The Giver. When was this published? A book published in 1993. My goodness, this is a 30-year-old book. Did I date some of you? This is a 30-year-old book. Let's talk about the plot. I realize as I've done some of these videos that I don't talk about the plot before I talk about the title, or I get into it and then I say the plot. So here's the plot. Main character Jonas lives in a society where everything has been stripped away as much as possible to ensure a sameness. The communities participating in this dystopia removed the concept of choice in order to keep everything under idyllic control, with the long-term goal being the eradication of pain and suffering, but at the cost of losing all the pleasures of life such as love and joy. Jonas, our main protagonist, is a light-eyed boy who, at his ceremony of 12, is supposed to be given his role in the community that he will perform for the rest of his all-adult life. It's called the Ceremony of 12 because he's turning 12 years old. Instead, he is selected to be the receiver of memories. As receiver, Jonas bears the burden of both pain and pleasure of life that no one else experiences in order to perpetuate this highly controlled society. Because this knowledge has to be contained in one person to prevent everyone from experiencing it, and because this knowledge has a wisdom that the community relies on when they encounter things they don't understand. This drives Jonas to almost insanity as he comes to terms with how deprived his friends and family are. When Jonas learns the release of someone meant death and not removal from the community to a special community no one else can go to, he has a complete mental breakdown, which results in his choice to escape the community and thereby releasing all of the memories he's contained to everyone else, allowing them to experience all of the things that Jonas learned while being the receiver of memories. His well-thought-out plan is ruined when a baby named Gabriel, that Jonas's father has been caring for in the last year, is scheduled for release because Gabriel isn't meeting the community standards for an infant. Jonas kidnaps Gabriel and flees the community, and it ends ambiguously with Jonas and Gabriel arriving at a cabin in the middle of a snowy expanse. It's easier to think of Jonas like a Pandora box, and that when he leaves the community, the box opens. He holds everything that is bad in the world kind of like a scapegoat so that no one else has to feel it. That they are effectively sacrificing Jonas to suffer so that the rest of them don't. So what does the title refer to? The giver as a title has multiple meanings. The first is the literal role of the giver, as in someone who gives. Jonas is selected to be the receiver of memories, and when the actual receiver of memories calls Jonas the receiver of memories, Jonas, who is trained by his community to employ clear and precise language, tries to tell the actual receiver of memories that he, Jonas, is just in training. The receiver of memories tells him that as of now, on day one, Jonas was the receiver, and Jonas eventually asks how Jonas is supposed to refer to him, and he simply states that he is the giver. So the giver is not an official title, it's an honorific that the receiver of memories gives himself when Jonas becomes the receiver of memories, and that is dictated on day one. So now the receiver of memories is the giver, and Jonas is the receiver of memories. The giver's secondary meaning is this implied dynamic between the giver and the receiver. There's a relationship there and an emotional bond between two people, something that the sameness community is devoid of. There's no genuine bonds, only assignments given by elders. People have friendships, but the long-term ones are by design, since people tend to only be friends with those in their community role or job, their job effectively. So if we look at the giver as a title, what kind of meaning can we parse out when we interpret this book, specifically with its title at the centerpiece? I know I realized that I didn't do this for The Maidens, and I just went into why The Maidens is not a good novel. Anyways, so we're gonna use the title framework to look at this with the title at its center point. While this book is about Jonas and effectively the devolution of a 12 going on 13-year-old's mental state as they come to terms with the concepts of pleasure and pain, the title Giver hints us to look at the giver more than we would need to look at Jonas. The giver as a character is drenched in guilt. His daughter Rosemary was selected to be the next receiver of memories. As she experienced emotional pain, she eventually applied for release and asked to insert the syringe herself, effectively taking her own life. In this book, after Rosemary's first introduction to pain, specifically grief and loss, the giver couldn't bear to give her physical pain and continued with the emotional side of the negative experience. It can be interpreted that the giver caused Rosemary to have depression, and he fed into it by reinforcing it with other emotionally negative experiences, causing her to spiral completely out of control and take her own life. Jonas has a whole experience with the word love, being admonished by his parents for not using precise language. In fact, Jonas's initial reaction to love was that it could be dangerous, but he lacked the words to articulate why. He sees this scene of a Christmas celebration, he feels all of the love, and he says after it's over, he tells the giver it's dangerous. The giver says why, and Jonas doesn't really know why, and then he decides to point out the literal danger in the memory. Fireplace. He says, well, the fireplace is dangerous even if it's pretty. He totally doesn't even explain why love could be dangerous. Jonas doesn't know how to articulate that. The giver, the character himself, the giver is the danger of love that Jonas can't articulate. The giver loved Rosemary so much, he couldn't bear to give her physical pain. And you could make a solid argument that it was partially responsible for why she took her own life, that's why it happened. Developmentally, this makes sense. Think back to your own childhood. Your earliest memories of pain and suffering are probably physical pain, a broken arm, a scraped knee. Kids who experience excessive emotional pain too young end up having problems later in life. These kids often don't have the wisdom to know how to advocate for themselves, and they might not have the language to articulate the problem, nor a support system or resources available. Rosemary, absolutely didn't have the knowledge, the wisdom, or any resources to get help. Release was the only readily available option to get what happened to her to stop. And that's because the sameness community got rid of all of this stuff so that no one would have to experience it. And it was going to have to be Rosemary's job to carry the burden so everyone else could be free from it. And she, a 12-year-old, could not survive it. The most traumatic experience in my life came about when I was about 10 or 11 years old. So I'm actually a really good life reference for how an experience like this compounds over time. I have PTSD from it and never told anyone about how afterwards I had sort of fantasized about being dead because I was afraid everyone would call me an attention whore. That was the simple of it. I was afraid most of my life that if I expressed the things that were going on, my troubles, that I would just get labeled as an attention whore because that's what I saw in the media. That's what I saw everyone do. People who had the same problems as me were just labeled as attention seekers. I never verbalized it until college to a friend of mine, and then I made the mistake of telling my two best friends about it. And when I had a massive spiral and reached out for one of them for help, all I got back was, "I can't help you in the suicide hotline." When I told my ex that same night, after backing out from a genuine attempt, he said I better be serious when I say something like that. I went to bed mad at myself that I couldn't do it because now no one was ever going to take me seriously when I was in such a desperate need of help and in this pit of self-loathing and hate. No one was going to believe me. I was dragged only a few months later to an emergency counseling service by a different friend because the moment he suspected I might end my life, he took it absolutely seriously. And all of this was sourced in events of my traumatic childhood event, a sentiment that is built up over years and years and years of no one noticing that I was slowly falling apart. Rosemary did not just get one traumatic event at 12 years old, she got several of them back to back. A whole 9-course meal of the worst emotional human experience. It's impressive that she survived 5 weeks as a 12-year-old that before this only really maybe knew about a scraped knee. And it's a part of the program that she's not allowed to receive any medication or medical aid if it's related to her receiver of memory tasks. She was doomed to fail. So of course the giver feels guilty. He messed up incredibly, and it was because he loved Rosemary. He couldn't bring himself to ease her into more complex experiences like that in the way that he did with Jonas. Not that he eased Jonas in, but he started with what was familiar, physical pain, and then evolved it into the more complex human emotions and human pain. To make matters worse, when Rosemary was released, her Pandora box, like I said, think of the receivers of memories like Pandora boxes. When they're gone, the box opens, everyone gets all of the stuff that they know back. So when Rosemary was released, her Pandora box opened, which meant the whole sameness community, collectively, after having no real interaction with complex human emotions, experienced intense emotional pain, from loss to grief to starvation and poverty. The Giver'S said it was a complete disaster and absolutely had to be a nightmare. They did get a lot of good memories from Rosemary because the Giver talks about giving her so many great ones, but I remind you, Rosemary spiraled into a depression that was fed by the emotional pain of the memories she received. If she couldn't handle it, what makes you think anyone out there in the sameness community could? Nobody talks about what happened during that period of time because it is so painful. Jonas asks his parents, they don't give him any answers, and my theory is that a majority of the people either took their own life or asked for release. And those that asked for release were probably denied since they knew that this was a unique problem. So they might have just taken their own lives anyways while the Giver attempted to do some serious damage control in order to save the strongest part of the population, the people who could withstand this. Jonas would have been 2 at the time, which meant that if Jonas experienced anything, he probably doesn't remember it. But it might have affected him anyways. That's entirely possible. My earliest signs of depression in my own memory are in 4th grade, a year before my traumatic experience, but I could not tell you why I had gained such an intense apathy for everyone and everything around me. I just don't remember it. Jonas recalls a memory when he was 3 years old and his friend Asher was punished so severely for consistently mixing up words that Asher went mute for a while. It's possible Jonas remembers it because at the time Jonas would have remembered what happened when he was 2, and that gave him empathy for Asher, which is why Jonas might remember what he considered a traumatic event for Asher, but not for himself. I know what major struggles my friends went through because I felt empathy for them. I emotionally connected with their experience. I couldn't tell you what I ate last week because there's nothing cementing those memories into place. I feel that the title, by pointing at the Giver as a central, most important character, is by extension pointing at the death of Rosemary. The Giver's mistake, his guilt, his love for her that hurt the entire community. When Jonas plans to escape, he begs the Giver to go with him, but the Giver remains. He knows what happened the last time the community got his memories back, and I think he knows that if he left, they got everything back all at once, the entire community would take their own life in confusion and madness. Someone has to stay behind to help everyone cope, especially the children. And while Rosemary's death is sad and tragic, it has given the Giver practical experience on how to handle this similar situation a second time. Rosemary's death is no longer one in vain, then. It's without question that the Giver would have rather have struggled and had Rosemary alive than have her death be the reason why he has the practical knowledge to help the sameness community. But the reality is that she did die, and he does have this wisdom, and this might be that small gain out of a tremendous loss. She has given the Giver hope that he can feasibly do this, and in turn, that makes her the Giver, perhaps the Giver the title was pointing to all along. Jonas also embodies the Giver. Gabriel is a light-eyed child like Jonas, who cannot seem to sleep through the night at the Nurture Center. Jonas, realizing that the Giver-receiver dynamic is only possible through people with light-colored eyes, gives Gabriel memories to help him sleep, which works. There's an implication here that Gabriel was not born defective, he's just probably feeling neglected in a way that no one in the sameness community understands. Jonas has the ability to see beyond, allowing him to see color. The Giver can hear beyond and hear music. It's entirely possible that baby Gabriel was having an experience, but being newborn obviously can't articulate it. In Sun, when Gabriel is 15, it's revealed that Gabriel can kind of feel beyond, according to the wiki. And it's within reason that baby Gabriel might have been doing that as a baby, and it freaked him out. There are so few light-eyed children that it's possible many of them were scheduled for release because they weren't meeting infant standards, much like Gabriel, because they might have been experiencing things differently, which caused distress as the babies, and because no one else in the sameness community understands what they're experiencing, they have no way to help these children. I genuinely believe that Gabriel was only allowed an extra year to acclimate because of his light eyes. The sameness community needs light-eyed people waiting in the wings so there can be a new receiver to quickly replace a receiver if one dies by accident, and they need them to procreate more light-eyed children for the future. The Giver says that Rosemary is his daughter, but does not confirm if she was placed like Jonas and Lily were placed with his parents, or if he was her biological father. I think he was her biological father, and they placed her with him because he's the receiver. To them, this probably felt like a match made in heaven. She'll be raised by the persons whose job she'll take over, and surely that will give her the best chance at taking his role. They were wrong, but still, it made sense in concept. So if Gabriel hadn't been scheduled for release, he probably would have been asked to provide sperm to help procreate more light-eyed children. However, that's done in the sameness community. I got conflicting answers on Google. Some says it's artificial insemination, others say it's a special intercourse ritual. I'm convinced of this because Claire, his light-eyed mother, becomes a birth mother. That means Catherine, the little girl Jonas says also has light eyes, probably would have become a birth mother too. So why does the Giver work so well as a title? It does this because, one, there's so much depth contained in it. Look how long this video is. All of this thing that I was able to talk about with the Giver, just around the concept of the Giver and using the Giver as a launching pad. There's so much room for interpretation. My conclusions are drawn from a framework of an adult. I don't think as a middle schooler I would have focused on Rosemary's death as much as I do now. I also never realized how much of a mental breakdown Jonas has realizing the truth. So much that if this was written with an adult audience in mind, it might have leaned more into that psychological horror aspect. There's some intense horror in this novel for something a 5th grader reads. Jonas has a PTSD episode over watching kids play war after experiencing the slow and painful death of war himself. This is about a 12-year-old having a mental breakdown. This is intense to read as an adult. Every time you remember that Jonas is 12. It also works because the title, The Giver, points at its themes, that it's about the relationship between the giver and the receiver. It's about the way we connect with people for better or for worse. It serves us to remind us that both the act of giving itself and the character of the giver hold the key to the deeper themes and the meaning of the story. This is titling at its best. Normally, I'd also go into who says the giver for the first time and that significance, but it's the giver who calls himself the giver, and I feel like I've explained all of this to death. Could there be other titles? Yes. Do I think any of them would work quite as well as the giver? No. However, if this was straight up like a horror novel, I think the capacity to see beyond would be really catching for this. Just like that has horror novel vibes. If you haven't read this, I read it in a day. It's a really fast read. It's meant for 5th graders. Go read this book. It's a read. It's a read. All right, that's it. Goodbye.